I think we'll start with the next session. I'm Eve Blau, and this session is on applied research. And the brief, or the description of it, as you have in your program, is applied research, or the instrumental use of teaching and academia's theories, methods, and techniques for the purpose of real transformation of the urban realm. So that's, I want to sort of deconstruct that a little bit in terms of, and I see this session as being about that, of examining some of these terms and what we mean by them. What is applied research? What kind of research can be applied, and to what conditions and what issues? And if so, how do you do it? What is the relationship between research and design practice? What about research as practice and practice as research? And we'll hear about both of those some more today. And finally, how do we conceive instrumentality? What is the instrumentality here that we are interested in, that we're seeking? Is it social? Is it political? Is it internal to design? Is it all of those things? So that I think that also what is at issue here is fundamentally the relationship between research and theory, and in theory I include history, actually. Research and theory and design practice. And the question, as I see it, is not only how to make them speak to one another, but how to make them critical for one another. Research and theory and design are in fact three practices. It's not like there's practice and then there's research and there's theory. There are three practices that are indelibly intertwined and overlapping. And especially today, I would say, when conditions of practice are so dynamic and so multivariate, that any project, any design project, has to begin with research just to understand what the conditions are on the ground, or are being dealt with, to sort of understand what is even there. And the issues are not only in a dynamic state, but they're also multiscalar and interscalar, I would say. And by that I mean that they involve multiple and often overlapping levels of government, local, regional, national, and transnational, and also a range of political and economic issues. And theory, of course, is essential in conceptualizing the relationship between the social and the spatial, the political and the spatial structures. So I would say, just to sort of frame this in a certain way, the question is, are these conditions that we're working in today, are they in fact blurring the boundaries between these practices? Is research becoming, or can it become, a form of intervention in itself? Can it become even design? And are design practices at the urban scale becoming, or can they become, more research-driven and not only speculative, but actually experimental, engaging and employing experimentalist practices? And by that I mean not only trying new things, but actually examining and assessing the outcomes over time, which is an experimentalist practice, and also producing architectural knowledge. So is research, is practice, and can practice become more experimentalist in this sense, and through that generate new methodologies for understanding conditions that are hybrid and kinetic and in a state of constant transition. So I'm putting out these suggestions that actually what we're dealing with is a set of conditions that really problematize the relationship between research and design practice, And that if we are looking forward, might even suggest new directions where there's a kind of merging of the disciplines, or they're not really disciplines, and that I think is the important thing, but merging of these practices. So these are some of the issues and questions that are, I feel, are raised by the framing of this session, which is actually, I think, more provocative than it might at first seem. And that both speakers, in different ways, are going to take up this afternoon. So I'd like to get on with that, and I will introduce our first speaker, who is Marc Angélil, who is professor and dean of the Department of Architecture of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, the ETH. His research in urban design within the Urban Design Institute of the Network City and Landscape Center addresses recent developments at the periphery of large metropolitan regions and focuses on strategies to support sustainable urban processes. Marc is the author of several books, including Deviations, a manual on methods of teaching, and Indicium on the political economy of contemporary urban territories. He's taught at a number of architectural institutions, including the GSD and the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, aside from the ETH. And he also has an architecture practice, AGPS Architecture, which is an architectural cooperative with offices in Los Angeles, where he's building a children's museum, and Zurich. He has numerous built projects, including the new midfield terminal at the airport of Zurich and the town center, and light rail station in Esslingen. Current urban projects include the aerial tram infrastructure project in Portland, Oregon, and a slum upgrading project in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And it's that project and the research, as he puts it, in vitro to in vivo and vice versa, that he's going to talk about today. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Yves, for the introductory remarks. It is a great pleasure to be here back at the GSD. Since we are in the session on applied research, I would like to offer a kind of narrative shop talk on our work. So let me begin with this montage, merging the outlines of the African continent with an illustration from Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There from Lewis Carroll, raising the question of how and when to enter a specific research undertaking and how and when to exit a particular field of study, while acknowledging then that entries are more often than not coincidental and that the exit must be design, so exiting by design. Specifically, I would like to take you to Ethiopia and its capital, Addis Ababa, that you see here on the slide. Addis Ababa has approximately 4 to 5 million inhabitants, and Ethiopia about 80 million inhabitants. Low on the list of rankings, such as the Human Development Index, Ethiopia is repeatedly cast as one of the poorest nations in the world. So Angelo is Angelo. We are going to talk also about poverty, knowing that poverty is both a condition of despair and of dealing with scarcity, but also that poverty is a construction projected, so a projection. Imagine a projection of the concept of poverty onto a country such as Ethiopia. So, as Yves mentioned, the title of my presentation is from in vitro to in vivo research and vice versa. In other words, I would like to briefly address the relationship between theory and practice, with teaching, for example, design studios, as the bridging element or the connection and threshold between the two. But one cannot view Africa without addressing the age of colonization. Okay? In the slide, the map of the continent showing the appropriation of territories by European countries in the early 1930s, maybe in the mid-1930s. Today, Africa seems hardly capable of freeing itself from its past, and Ethiopia is no exception. Although this country was nearly able to maintain its autonomy during the era of colonization, Ethiopia was occupied by Mussolini only for a very short period of time, from 1936 to 49. It has more than its own share of difficulties: food insecurity, unstable political structures, migration from rural to urban centers, insufficient sanitation, corruption, hordes of political refugees at its border, the AIDS epidemic, etc., etc. So, according to academic conventions, our research started in the libraries, trying to understand forms of north-south dependencies. What kind of intellectual discourses were constructed in terms of how to view cultures that are foreign to us, whether in the writings of Claude Lévi-Strauss, for example, in Triste Tropique, or Félix Guattari's elaboration on micropolitics in Brazil. One specific text caught our attention, a travelogue by Michel Leiris, covering an expedition to Africa in the 1930s, an undertaking organized by the French Natural History Museum and the Institute of Ethnology of the University of Paris, known as the Ethnographic and Linguistic Mission Dakar-Djibouti from 1931 to 1933. So it started in Dakar, crossed the continent, stopped briefly in Addis Ababa, and continued to Djibouti. The young writer Leiris, that we'll see in one of the next slides, those are photographs taken during the exhibition. Leiris is this gentleman here. The young writer Leiris was commissioned as secretary and archivist of the expedition. He was basically a kid at the time. Instead of adopting the method of objective analysis, Leiris took the liberty to frame his observations with more subjective modes of engagement. His notes were recorded in the form of a journal published as L'Afrique Fantôme in 1934, just 1 year after the expedition. The book reads like a diary that mirrors the reality of things, conflating self-reflexive bias with fact. This led to a scandal back at home in Paris. His reports laid bare the arrogance of the West vis-à-vis indigenous cultures, the reserved point of view of the scientists looking at the subject matter from above, and the exploitative ethos of the colonial political economy vis-à-vis annexed nations. According to Leiris, Africa could not be observed from a remote vantage point. On the contrary, one could only encounter another culture when one is willing to question his own position. In other words, what is investigated must be understood as a process that mutually defines both the one who sees and what is seen. Africa performs as a mirror, so to say, as referred to by the title of the recently published collection of Leiris' work, Miroir de l'Afrique, Africa as Mirror. And it is in this respect that the mirror could be used as a trope to frame different modes of research endeavors. One might consider research as an identity-forming process. While looking at another culture, unexpected mirror effects come into play, as one's own image is reflected in the object of investigation. A feedback mechanism is here at work where observation takes on a self-reflective role, possibly in the sense of Jacques Lacan's mirror stage, representing a formative function of the self. The viewer is permanently caught and captivated by his own image, call it a trap, from which research can hardly escape. Or one might consider research as a type of mirror that entices viewers to penetrate its surface, to enter into another world, and from there to take a glance back through the mirror at the familiarities that the viewer thinks to know. Research is here thresholds between parallel spaces, each echoing and transforming the other. Realities often deemed to be true are destabilized and aspects of their fictional constructions unraveled. Or one might consider research as a rear-view mirror, revealing events ready to overtake in the fast lane, in full awareness that the objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. For the viewer looking ahead while simultaneously looking back, the mirror forecasts potential courses of action, at times in a sort of back-to-the-future setting in which anticipated paths and present circumstances merge. Here, the foretelling function of research, a kind of crystal ball projection, is marked by the dependency of constructed pasts and imagined futures. So, we finally went to Ethiopia, not exactly knowing what to expect. The initial perception was marked by romantic and preconceived impressions of Africa, as depicted in Western literature, confirming atmospheres that exude an air of exoticism for an outside observer. The dynamics of transaction, the hustle and bustle of activities, the assortment of goods as well as colors and smells are indeed breathtaking. We even saw informality where none existed, and projected our image of slum settlements onto the housing stock of the city, not knowing that this low-rise carpet of huts and shelters is based on highly formalized norms of collective organization. In other words, we only saw what we wanted to see. Africa as the other, as opposed to us, strikingly different. The purpose of our expedition was quite simple. We are asked to present our thoughts on education in view of an intended university reform in a lecture series organized by the Addis Ababa University, the German Society for International Cooperation, and the Ethiopian Engineering Capacity Building Program. So this was our coincidental entry. The title of the lecture series, here on the publication, Engineering Towards Development and Change, foregrounded engineering as a discipline and not architecture and not urban design, which were considered subcategories of engineering. To be brief, the issue debated at a follow-up symposium with public officials and local university leaders was the impending urbanization of the country. So we kidnapped basically the lecture series to talk about the urbanization of the country, and thus the need for a strong school of architecture that would also include urban design. One specific issue addressed that would much later become important to the research was the need to strengthen rural communities and to improve conditions in small villages outside the city in order to slow down migration to the city centers. In any case, the debates on education led to an official agreement. Okay, so now we are really applied between the Swiss Federal Council and the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, ratified both in English and Amharic in 2008. This is practice at work. And it's not easy to convince these government officials to sign contracts. Thus, in turn, and this in turn allowed us to establish an academic exchange program, also to secure the means for the endeavor, an exchange program with the Addis Ababa University, with both faculty in the upper row and students in the lower row, joining ETH Zurich for a year under the condition that they would return to Ethiopia to teach or continue their studies. This was an important condition. But most importantly, we were instrumental under the leadership of two colleagues, Dirk Hebel and Franz Oswald, in convincing the government to create a new school, the Ethiopian Institute of Architecture, Building Construction and City Development, part of the Addis Ababa University, and to allocate a series of more or less abandoned buildings for a new campus. So we were giving a campus that required to be fixed. And this is where research encountered a reality shock, with the applied component taking the lead. The site needed to be cleaned, okay, chairs were recycled and repaired, teaching spaces furbished, and equipment, old equipment from the ETH Zurich taken to Ethiopia and installed. And with this, then finally teaching could begin with design studios that we know at all the schools, at our schools, addressing the pressing problems of urban and rural transformation. During our visits, and with the help of student research, other facets of Africa were brought to the forefront, primarily pertaining to the influence of global markets on indigenous culture, leaving their traces on the organization of both social and physical space. Office buildings clad in curtain walls of glass, suburbia-type developments merging at the fringes of Addis Ababa, the construction of a ring road circumscribing the core of the city, cutting through neighborhoods, tenement construction such as the Grand Housing Project supported by the German Society for International Cooperation with, by the way, toilet balls manufactured in China, and a new phenomenon, large-scale land transfers from the public hand to foreign investors for food and flour production intended for export, generally known as land grabbing. And there is more to come with investors and developers, whether private companies or public sovereign funds, knocking at the door, all bridging new forms, all bringing new forms of colonization to Africa. With China as an important player, offering funds and know-how for infrastructure projects on the left, for the construction of an important freeway interchange, or on the right, a gift to the African Union, basically the entire African Union, okay, as a gift, headquarters that was inaugurated just a few days ago by the President of the People's Republic of China. And as announced in a Merrill Lynch publication, The New Africa, it's investing's final frontier, a land of vast untapped resources and markets, and a people eager for progress. This is a quote. In other words, Africa is a contested territory, up for grabs, with multiple players claiming the right to appropriate its resources, leaving a continent in pieces, ultimately giving credence to the African Union's call that Africa must unite, as propagated on its website portal. The next step in our research allowed us to discover yet another side of local culture, one pertaining to the self-empowerment and confident and assertive and self-empowerment of confident and assertive stakeholders. We encountered form of resistance vis-à-vis outside forces. A case in point were events surrounding the Mercato district that you see on the left, one of the largest African markets with a population of about 200,000 to 250,000 inhabitants living and working there. A Malaysian consortium was attempting a takeover of the quarter with the intention of turning the Mercato into a business and shopping district a la Dubai. The affair set off a public debate on the future development of the city, a public debate that was promoted also by the press and was accompanied by two occurrences that facilitated the resolution of the conflict. First, the standoff reinforced social ties within the community, as well as galvanized its potential representation within the city at large. The worker associations were proactive in demanding an equal voice in shaping their environment. New trade unions and building cooperatives were formed that further strengthened communal bonds, ultimately leading to the construction of collectively owned vertical markets, such as the one that you see on the slide on the right. Second, at the time of the clash, the municipal administration was in the process of revisiting the existing zoning ordinance, the Addis Ababa Development Plan. An entire chapter of building regulations was drafted for the Mercato era, with its stakeholders' participation and communication as key tenets of the zoning code. And it was at this point that we were ready to publish our first observations. So this is where we now come in as researchers writing, okay? Very solitary work, ultimately leading to a book publication on projections for urban and rural transformation in Ethiopia, a book entitled Cities of Change, Addis Ababa. This is what we normally do within academia and what is expected from researchers within the framework of academic convention. Okay? This is quite important to secure funds for the research. So this is another type of practice that comes into the game. We then had the opportunity to exhibit the work at the Venice Biennale 2008, using the installation as another vehicle to further accelerate research work, in this case through the production of several film clips that you see here in the image. Let's see if it's working. Conceived as a comparative analysis of urban scenes in the Western world and Africa. So we were constantly comparing the two and focusing on specific subject matters such as the circulation of goods, food security, water management, mobility, leisure, religion, and their effects on the constitution of territory. This analysis established the foundation for design propositions that were projected both on screens in the Swiss pavilion of the Venice Biennale and on physical models that you see at the bottom of the urban terrain, taking the research into the realm of design. Though we were honored to be part of the Biennale, it was, however, and it seemed much more important to show the work in Addis Ababa in order to promote a discourse on future projections of the city. The problem was that we could not find an appropriate space large enough on campus to exhibit the projects. Thus, we proposed to construct a building using discarded shipping containers to frame the structure of an exhibition pavilion that would later be donated by the ETH to the University of Addis Ababa in a formal ceremony. Containers are, as a matter of fact, used throughout the city as building components, recirculated and recycled within construction for particular purposes. So the structure was then erected and the exhibition installed, showing design work done by both African and European students in the context of design studios. The projects were used as a platform for discussions with state officials, local authorities, and members of the architectural profession, reinforcing the notion of urban design as a forum for debates on the future of the city. Two projects in particular attracted attention. A proposition for a network of towns surrounding Addis Ababa, as you see here, in order to strengthen agricultural communities in the countryside and slow down migration. And on the right, a housing project as an alternative to the official grant housing program, using a combination of prefab and self-built construction with the support of micro and small enterprises within the construction sector. Such propositions needed to be brought back to the public. In collaboration with our Ethiopian partners, we co-edited a series of issues of the local architectural journal Construction Ahead on the role of urban design in city development. And every architect in the city read them. This is unbelievable. Nobody reads our pieces that we write in the Western world. And suddenly they were front stage. The next phase of the research involved a collaboration with material scientists from the ETH, focusing on the use of construction materials within the building sector. Most materials and products in Ethiopia are imported, which as a matter of fact makes no sense whatsoever considering the vast amount of local resources. So we launched a summer school, interdisciplinary summer schools with students from a series of disciplines from Europe and Ethiopia, basically testing alternative construction techniques, so very hands-on, using local materials, such as walls made of compressed mud and clay, and vaulted thin shell construction for ceiling and roofs, or with the support of the UN, the reuse of wheat bags filled with sand for the construction of refugee shelters that could be easily erected, or the use of bamboo as an easily available and fast-growing building material for the construction of small and large-scale structures, such as a pavilion for local textile exhibition. These experiments established a basis for an understanding of construction methods that could be deployed in the proposed towns in rural region. In the meantime, work on these towns had progressed with a series of plans drawn by Ethiopian and European architects working in collaboration for the gradual development of an urban framework that could grow over time. We allotted a site near Bahir Dar in the Amhara region in the north of the country for construction on a publicly owned piece of land, a commons, near a village that could hardly sustain itself in terms of food production. The project included a system of water distribution channels for agriculture, a tree nursery, as well as simple shelters equipped with rainwater tanks that you see on the right. Our collaborators on site, a young Swiss and Ethiopian architect, so the Swiss architect is paid by the Swiss government, the Ethiopian by the Ethiopian governments, are working in tandem in situ to organize the construction process and secure communication with local authorities and farmers. A feedback mechanism, for example in form of monthly reports, were established in order to maintain a dialogue between the researchers at home and the team on site. The town was then inaugurated in an official ceremony with local community representatives in the summer of 2010, with the laying of a foundation stone that you see here in the center and an endless number of speeches. But somehow things went wrong. A few days later, the small monument was destroyed, as local stakeholders believed that our project was nothing other than a ruse to land grab publicly owned land for industrial agriculture and export-driven flour production. Basically, we had relied on communication with public representatives and neglected to directly involve in a participatory process and correctly inform an important group of local farmers. So Jürgen Habermas' theory of communicative action had reached an impact due to a lack of communication. So in order to remedy the situation, a public meeting was organized with the support of the local priests, acting as translator and mediator. A digital projector was installed, powered by a car battery, and the drawings were projected on the wall of a building, and the team was given the opportunity to explain the objectives of the undertaking. So, starting, go back to zero and do not collect $200. We basically received feedback from the community, and a new plan was drawn showing the key components of the project, the water basin, the tree nursery, the road, etc. The plan was submitted to the town council for approval, ultimately leading to another public meeting under the fig tree that is in the center of the town, followed by a referendum that took place in the fall of 2011, so just a few months ago. The community unanimously endorsed the project. And with this, construction could begin, first of an access road leading to the site and connecting the new neighborhood with the existing village, followed by the building of a water catchment basin and dam. A rendering of one of the house units was displayed on an existing structure to inform inhabitants. And here, the most recent images that we received just a few days ago, the construction of a prototype frame for housing unit and the digging of the first foundations. This is where we currently stand. So let me conclude with the notion of the mirror as a trope, indexing different modes of investigation, research as an identity-forming process, seeing one's own image reflected in the very object of investigation, research as a mirror to penetrate and enter another world, and from there to take a glance back through the mirror at our own familiarities, and research as a rear-view mirror with the viewer looking simultaneously back and ahead, projecting future trajectories and potential courses of action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Michelle Provost, who is an architectural historian, a curator, and consultant on urban planning and architecture affairs. She presently directs the International Newtown Institute. In 1994, she founded the office Crimson Architectural Historians in Rotterdam, which is the only independent professional architectural history office that I know of. An actual practice outside of the University of Architectural History. With Crimson, she is engaged in a large number of research and design projects in the fields of urban planning, architecture, and art, and has published numerous books, including the recent Rising in the East, Contemporary New Towns in Asia. And in addition, Michelle has been a curator at the Netherlands Architecture Institute and a project leader of WIMBY, which is Welcome in My Backyard, an urban regeneration project in Rotterdam, Hoogvliet. And today she's going to talk about the current research she's directing at the Institute, at the International Newtown Institute, which is mostly centered in Asia. Please welcome Michelle.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Eve, and also thanks for the invitation for me to be here again. It's a great pleasure. Since the theme of this block is actually applied research, I might have better chosen the WIMBY project maybe to present, the Welcome into My Backyard project that Eve just mentioned, or for that matter any other project of my office, because I think they all deal more or less with applied research. But I have nonetheless chosen to present you this other research project, which is not really applied yet. So this is a work in progress. It has reached the stage of the traditional book that we all choose to present our findings in. And the next phase of being applied still has to happen. So any ideas on that we could develop during the discussion. The reason that I've chosen this is because it's more relevant to me, it's more actual, and also because one of the things that triggered me in the introduction, in the invitation for today's conference was what should be on the agenda for urban design these days? What are we forgetting? What should urban design or planning, or we could discuss the differences and the overlap between the two later. So what is relevant for the discipline now? And this is actually what I think is very relevant. So that's why I chose this. The International Newtown Institute is in fact, well, again, merging with Crimson architectural historians. So I'm working on this with a number of my colleagues from Crimson. It is an institute which is especially focused on knowledge and research on new cities, working together with universities in Holland and abroad. And well, focusing on these new cities is something which I could explain very easily. A new city is different from a historic city in the sense that it has been decided upon, usually by political decision, and master planned at one moment in time and then laid out. So it's a city which hasn't historically grown or organically grown, but has been planned in one streak. And while you could think that this is quite exceptional, it's actually not. It's also a very historical phenomenon that dates back thousands of years BC, and that we actually have acquired a database of more than 1,200 cities over the years. So it has been an assignment for architects and planners for centuries. By now, we are experiencing a vast boom of these new cities around the world, but this is not the first period that this has happened. And you might be familiar with this 50s and 60s generation of new cities, which basically were built in Western Europe and were very strongly tied with the social democracy and the rising of the welfare state. And which also used very familiar building types, relying on industrialization and mass production, and a modernist, Siam-like ideology and composition. And this was gradually exported around the world. As you can see, there are strikingly different, strikingly similar images, even if they're in very different parts of the world. Like this is Hoogvliet, the Netherlands, where the WIMBY project was taking place. But this is, well, it could be almost be the same building system, but it's in Mongolia. So also separately from the social democrat ideology, this typology of both the architecture as well as the urban planning got exported and expanded around the world. So this is very typical of this 50s, 60s generation. And but a thing which is very important to remember that this previous generation was later developed into a different type of new towns by the Team 10 generation, for instance, or by the suburban years of the 70s. This one is especially also interesting, the Robin Hood Gardens by the Smithsons. So as to show you that these typologies of new towns in the post-war period were the products of concepts of architects, of urban planners. So this issue of what the future city should be, both in as a composition, as architecture, as ideology, that was in the focus of architecture debate. And something that were numerous conferences like this were dedicated to. And these were the results. Well, of course, even if you debate something for a long time, it doesn't mean that you have a guarantee for success. Especially these modernist cities have become the field of, well, the battlefields like this. For instance, the French banlieues looked like this in 2005, and especially these modernist cities with high-rise slabs and these geometric compositions have become associated with social problems and have been under a lot of scrutiny since then. And of course, the most familiar new town that you probably know, Brasilia, is sort of the prototype of this. So in the debates, I'm not sure how that is in the US, but in the debates in Holland, This kind of urban planning is usually referred to as Le Corbusier planning, Siam planning. You mentioned it's all being put on one big heap and without anyone seeing the nuances or the sort of conceptual efforts that went into it. This is being denounced as inhuman, anonymous, the way that we did it before, but we don't do it anymore. And on the contrary, the person that has made like a comeback recently is Jane Jacobs. So I would really say that she is by now the most popular architecture critic in the Netherlands. Her work has recently been, last year it has been translated, her book, and other books have been published, like this one, the Living City, on the contemporary meaning of Jane Jacobs. And this is a book which has recently been published, which is like a Jane Jacobs interpretation of Amsterdam. And this is, of course, the ideal. And the also equally famous, I would say, extensions of Amsterdam from the 30s and 40s, which are these Siam modernist extensions by the well-known Cornelis van Eesteren. Well known, I think. He denounces completely. So he says, I'm starting the fight with Van Eesteren. The poor guy has been dead for 30 years. But so there is a very strong consensus in the Netherlands that this kind of Jane Jacobs mentality of working in the city, small scale, mixed use, etc., is the right way to go, and the old modernist way is the wrong way. But of course, in Holland, we don't have a strong urbanization. We don't have any new cities being built anymore. The last city was that already dates from almost 40 years ago. And of course, the cities that are now being built largely are being erected in the global south, and especially in Asia. I'm sure you've all seen variations on this graphics, more than you actually wished for. I also noticed a kind of almost fatigue in architecture circles on this issue, proclaiming that 70% of the world population will live in cities in 2030. 9,000 cities will be built in that period, etc., etc. So it's all these large numbers that sort of blind you, and they also prevent people from being interested almost. Or what I also find in the Netherlands is that it purely points to an interest in favelas, slums, and sort of informal self-organized building. But these new towns, which are also a very strong trend, are being denounced as boring and corporate, and which they are, which they definitely are. But I think that is exactly the reason that they should be on the agenda of urban designers and urban planners, because they are not up to the qualitative level that they should be. This is basically the point where I'm trying to go. This is an image to show you that even while Jane Jacobs might be the most popular critic in the Netherlands, Dutch offices, architecture offices that work abroad, find that they cannot meet the needs of, for instance, China or Russia, or these great expanding and urbanizing societies with Jane Jacobs' methods. So as soon as they start working abroad, you see images like this, for instance, with which is a completely different scale, which uses these, I think Jane Jacobs would not like this. So, and it might be that for the US the same thing goes. While we are talking, well, I see a lot of discussions in the US going about new urbanism or about ecological urbanism or about all kinds of really poetic, form-driven, aesthetic notions, which I don't want to denounce because they are very important, but you see that as soon as you go look abroad, who is actually designing this large wave of urbanization and who is building all these really huge cities? It's American offices like SOM, KPF, HOK. So there's a small number of really big firms who are designing all these cities in a completely different way than I think we in academia would approve. Well now, so this book that I would like to talk about, Rising in the East, Contemporary New Towns in Asia. So we chose, well, we inventorized almost 200 new towns in being built for the last 2 decades, and we chose 16 of them to be in-depth, analyzed and described in this book. You see them on this map. This is the book. And in fact, we analyzed that there were 6 themes, which 6 categories that you could divide these cities in. If you were looking at the main goal, why they were built, and the main theme in their design. So just to explain briefly, of course, one category is eco-cities. So there's a large number of cities which are being built because they want to experiment with new types of ecological building, be it architecture or urban planning. Political cities, that's new capitals, basically. So cities that have a representative value for their government. Enclave cities is an interesting category because it almost goes for all these new towns. It points towards the need of the middle class, the upcoming middle class, to distance itself from the existing city in an enclave, in a city which is separate from the existing city. Economic cities are meant to boost the economy, national economy. High-tech cities, well, that sort of speaks for itself. It has to do with IT experiments and a complete focus of the city on IT possibilities. Shelter cities are basically consisting of housing. Well, so I'm not going to go through all these categories, but what I basically want to do is point out some of the problems with these cities. This one you might know is Masdar City, designed by Foster and parents and partners, and that was not on purpose. I'm sorry. It's just jet lag speaking. This one is being applauded as being one of the most ecological cities worldwide. Has a lot to go for itself, but of course you could ask, even if such a city is CO2 neutral, how ecological is it actually to build a city in a desert, which is the condition that this city is being erected in? And another eco-city, Tianjin in China, is actually, it's close to Beijing, a part of an economic development corridor. This is the way that it's being marketed. It's very green. It has a lot of photovoltaic equipment, etc. But as it happens a lot with these eco-cities, they're not more than a drop on a hot plate, really. Because even if this city would be completely ecological and don't leave and wouldn't make any footprint at all, it's still only 10 miles away from this area. which is the Tianjin steel plant, which is a hugely polluting factory. And this is only part of this whole economic development area. So these eco-cities are very often built to compensate for areas like this. So even, I'm not saying that you shouldn't experiment with eco-cities or that they are not important, but this definitely doesn't solve the problem, and it's often used as a kind of greenwashing, you could say. Another one, I think, is an example. Zira Island, just off of the coast of Baku. There was, it's also a very eco-friendly design by Bjarke Ingels Group, the Danish architecture firm. And this is really an interesting case because this island used to be, well, it's actually a barren rock. There's nothing there except for some ruins of a camp of prisoners of war. And it was used as a prison during Soviet time. So it has a very bleak and grim history, and it's being turned into this, yeah, sort of leisure, happy-go-lucky, yeah, rich man's paradise. Very, I don't think it's going to happen either. But again, this is a kind of greenwashing. Because most of, well, the problems of Baku and of the oil and urbanization topic that actually Eve told me she's researching is this kind of pollution. Of course, this kind of sort of slick architectural designs doesn't help these kind of problems. Another thing which is not being addressed by these kind of designs is the relation between the urban and the rural, and especially food production. So in any delta region in the world where this urbanization is taking place, you have this competition between urbanization and food production, and we all know the problems that have arisen from this already in China, and that is going to grow in a major way. So the first signs of food shortage are already there, and unless there are new urban concepts devised, I think this will only grow. And then, well, there's also the social aspects, because usually where these new towns are being built, it's not always that there were like greenfield developments. Usually there was already something there. Like in this case, in China, it's also very well known that these large portions of the historic city are being demolished. And then this is the new image, but it's also very clear that these people who used to live in these old neighborhoods are not going to move into these apartment blocks, but usually are being transported way out of the city and somewhere in the periphery. So also this, the aspects of social structure are something which is a very important issue to address, which is not being done at the moment. And of course we talk about these new cities as being the vehicles for mass migration, but well, I very strongly doubt that, because these people that are arriving at the Chinese stations every day, they don't really move into these new towns because they are invariably, the 16 new towns that are in this book are built for the middle class, upper middle class, or even higher. So poor rural migrants don't move into these new towns. So there's a different reason for that. There's not really a one-to-one connection between migration and the new towns. And this is not a rural migrant, that is, seems clear to me. And it is also being reflected in the typology of these cities, which are not aimed at the lower classes. This is near Shanghai. And another social aspect of these new towns is that they are often not only enclaves, but they're also gated communities. So this is still a welcome sign, but it's very secluded. It's for one kind of persons only, and it's like a little island in the middle of the existing city. In this case, it's BSD's city in the middle of Jakarta. In this case, it's in Cambodia. This one even has a gate that you have to, and some people that are checking you if you can go in or not. Now, this is the place where rural migrants go. This is a place near Hong Kong called Tin Shui Wai. So these are really high density, very sober housing environments without a golf court and without a lot of other things that are really indispensable for a good city. And this one is especially sad because it has a nickname, City of Misery. And it has, I don't know where it started, but it has been greatly enhanced also by literature and movies. This one is a movie shot in Tin Shui Wai. It says, living there is inescapable, dying there is inevitable. So this is a bit extreme, but there is a huge gap between the new towns for the upper middle class and the rural migrants and where they go. One other thing lacking, I would say, that is identity. These cities are becoming a sort of generic type that we see all over the world. And it would be impossible to say if this was in China or Korea. And it's also a lot of the same housing type. So the point block tower is all over. And it's an ubiquitous housing typology. As well as the car-based transport. So even if all these cities talk about ecological and pedestrian friendly, I don't see it. So it's basically highways and car traffic. And when there is something like a sort of identity, like this is the same city near Shanghai. It has a little core, which is called Thamstown. And as you see, this is pedestrian friendly. But it's just like maybe 200 or 300 houses in the middle of this city of 1 million people. So it's like an attraction, giving identity to this new city. There's no one living there. It's completely empty. The only reason that people go there is because it's the decor for their wedding pictures. This church is a perfect replica of the original in the UK, but it's used as a real estate office. And also, for our Dutch audience, there's a little replica of Amsterdam in one of the new towns. So these little imported cores of identity, but it's not Chinese identity. Okay, it's the attraction, that might be a Chinese way of making a city. But I would say that there is definitely the Chinese urban identity, but Chinese history is, as you know, not well respected and is not. Well, this is the way that, for instance, the Hutongs and the Lilangs are being dealt with in China a lot of times. So I would say the way that history and context and identity are treated is also one element which is severely lacking in these Newtown approach. And this is what the rest of this Newtown looks like. So it's the familiar image of mass-produced, very similar buildings. The role of, well, I'm finishing now. Just the role of architects to end up with. This is a beautiful design by Jean Nouvel for a Louvre museum in the Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi. And another beautiful building by Getty Museum. It's just, this is where you see Jean Nouvel, so it's quite close to each other. And then this is the skyline. So, well, this is a very familiar argument. architecture is very often used just as the icing on the cake, just as a few landmarks within an overall anonymous grid. So it is in fact very much, the role of architecture is very much reduced when you compare it to the role of architects in the 60s, when they were the conceptualizers of these new towns, including all the elements of social, economic, ideological aspects. So this is what is left of architecture, you could say. And who is taking over their place? I would say, as the end of the story gets a kind of a grim character, because I see that there is a number of new players in the field of urban planning, and they are very often the IT firms. So it's the Cisco, Siemens, Philips, those kind of players. These are the schemes that are really at the basis of New Songdo, which is in Korea, which looks quite generic and like any other city, but which is on the IT level, it's a very high level development. And which, yeah, says something about the role of urban design, because as you can see, the CBD is designed by KPF. It is modeled after the idea of Central Park in New York, so including the rocks, etc. These elements have all been remade. It's a high quality public space. But again, this is what is left of urban design in this city. It's a generic field of towers which are built by persons, companies that we don't know. And then the urban design is sort of contracted in this CBD and makes the most perfect high quality level little environments, but it is not involved in the overall conception of the city, and that is, I think, is a scary thing, and is something that, well, as I said, should be on the agenda, especially since this whole assignment of these thousands of new towns that need to be built in the coming decades is being taken up by guys like this. I understood that also in Boston he has left his mark in the Filene's failed project. Stan Gale, big developer, and he talks about cities in a box, and I don't think it's a joke. So we are talking now about a standardization, not on the level of houses or housing blocks, but on that of a whole city. And the concept of New Songdo, he has already sold twice to 2 different cities in China. And he's aiming to sell another 18 ones. So this is really something that we should take seriously, especially because also these companies like Siemens and Cisco have their own development companies working on this kind of cities. You might have also heard of charter cities. This is really a trend that will become very important in the next few decades, and that I think urban planners and urban designers are missing out on, it seems, and they should be in to raise the quality in the long term of these cities. Thanks.
Thank you both very much. I think I would like to start with a comment that you made, Mark, that struck me sort of increasingly powerfully as I listened to both of your talks, and that was that your discussion of the mirror and research in the mirror, and that when we examine places, foreign places, what we're really looking for is ourselves. And what we find is, to a certain extent, ourselves as well. And that, and a solution to our own problems. And that, in fact, we are going to examine certain issues that are that are of concern to us. And we're looking elsewhere to see, to really discover ourselves. And in a way, I think, and this became interesting to me when you started talking about Jane Jacobs. Two things here, the Jane Jacobs issue, and the other one of architecture doing something about poverty. And to find out a kind of an examination of the issues that you feel are really important for architecture, probably, I would say, in Europe at the moment. So I'd like to sort of throw that out and ask you whether that's in any way correct and how you think about that.
Yeah, I think it is correct. I mean, research is an identity-forming process, but it is one that is never clean. It's constantly, fractured and refractured, and it allows us to engage in new subject matters that were not obviously at the beginning of the investigation. So our excursion or expedition to Africa reframed our research, and we started to tackle themes that we would have never tackled before. So waste management. I'm not an expert in waste management, but I became obsessed with the phenomena, or sewage. We're all producing about a kilo of products that are thrown into a system, and you never see it. And it is a subject matter. Or cooperatives as an alternative model to the capitalistic system. So suddenly, and we discovered that we had cooperatives in Zurich for a very long time. So it was this detour to another culture. But don't misunderstand me. We are not doing research on poverty in order to perform a philanthropic act. Okay? This is, by the way, we might improve on certain conditions, but the important thing in Ethiopia is the moment when we leave. So the school was built and we are ready now to leave, and the Ethiopians will take over. With the city, we are not quite ready yet. We need a few more steps, and then we need to go again in order to address the conditions back at home.
So what would you say that you were in search of when you went there?
Well,
or the objective of the applied research?
The objectives were never clear at the beginning. So we might pretend that they were clear in order to get the funding for a research project. Because you have to always submit the objectives and the goals and the deliveries and etc. So you construct an argument which might help you in further developing the work, but the entry is truly coincidental and quite naive, as a matter of fact. As naive as Michel Léris when they went to Africa.
And as far as for the students, the sort of, I guess that there are two things that are involved here. One is the sort of academic product, and the other one is what have you actually done with applying the research in Addis?
Well, there are two types of students now. Okay,
yeah.
Working in collaboration. There are the Swiss students that are going to Ethiopia and suddenly realizing that there are other cultures on this globe. I mean, poverty. We cannot do poverty research in Switzerland. It doesn't work. So, but I can do poverty research in LA, which is quite interesting now, especially after the financial crisis. So I'm wondering whether I shouldn't do my slum research in our parts of the world. So for the Swiss students, this has been an unbelievable experience. and for the Ethiopian students as well, because they come to our culture, they see it as a model, but since we're critical of our own culture, they go, with a critical awareness back to their culture, in order not to do the cities that you've shown.
I'd like to ask you the same question, actually, in terms of what you were looking for and what you found and what you saw as the project, actually.
Well, of course, it's inevitable, and that's one of the unexpected benefits, I would say, that you also learn something about your own country when you go for research abroad. But in this case, I would say that it's basically the inertia in Western Europe, and especially in Holland, and the lack of dynamics and of building energy, which has struck me like never before. And that makes, in that sense, it also makes sense that Jane Jacobs would be like the most valuable sort of theory at this moment. So the difference between China and Holland, of course, is overwhelming. But I must say that we didn't go for any soul searching into China. We went there with the idea that our Western European experience with new towns, and also the way that they have failed us in a certain way, could be of value to India and China and the other nation states, because of this whole phenomenon of these new towns being so predictable. So they all have the same cycles of building too many housing of the same category, becoming outdated at the same moment after 25, 30 years, having certain focus in demography, which becomes unhealthy after a while. So you can go on and on about these elements, these characteristics of new towns, which are predictable. So, but then of course we found that the new towns in China function in a very different way, and even if they have the same cycles, these cycles are a lot shorter and go much faster. So there are lessons to be learned, but I also found that you have to be very modest in the sense that you can really understand these phenomena in a different cultural context.
When we talk about applied research, I guess my question is there applied and unapplied pure research in architecture? Do you see a difference?
Well, it has been constructed within our epistemological framework as being different.
Yes.
With clear hierarchy between theory and practice. With, theory flying high, from above, pristine, and practice dirty labor. So this is ingrained in the cultures that we operate. A higher value attributed to the logos and to thinking, as we talked before, than to making, okay, and techniques, dirty. That's interesting, and this needs to be challenged. Okay? And I'm not saying that we should reverse the relationship; it would make no sense. But to treat them as equals. Okay? I think we need the construction of knowledge. Okay? This should be maintained, and it is a form of practice, as you said in your introductory remarks. But we also need to understand exactly what is happening when you're dealing with the pragmatics of things, the logistics, meeting organization, the psychology of dealing with a governmental agency. This is all part of this messiness of this base materialism that runs our world. And we need to have knowledge about it. So first treat them at the same level, but don't merge them entirely. Okay? keep them separately, because you need also the moment to retract in theoretical constructions, but you have to have knowledge of the conditions of practice.
Well, what I find it interesting is the way that theory or research and practice influence one another mutually. So going back and forth between the two, I think that's very that's where the really results come from. But I must say, and that makes it really exciting, this to me personally, because our office has always been involved with small-scale projects, almost realized on an activist basis. Maybe you remember we wrote this article for the Harvard Design magazine, Ditch Urbanism. It was also about how to involve inhabitants in small-scale projects which were not motivated by any financial or economic reasons, but by a real need of the inhabitants, and then work together with them. So a completely different role for architects, just like the urban think tank, for instance, is working in the slums of Caracas. But how do you translate that kind of acupuncture into the scale of urbanism, onto this larger scale where you deal with completely different dynamics, different groups, and where the politics and the economics are completely different? That one I haven't found out yet. But I do think that there is a task here for the architects, unfortunately, to get involved with the economical side of things. Because it's not a lack of ideas or concepts that we are talking about, why these cities are being built as they are. Even in China, there's an avant-garde of architectural offices which can really compete with the best offices here, and but they don't get their designs built. And so why is that? It's probably not the quality of their designs, but it could either be politics, or it could be the lack of a business model that would be sufficiently convincing for clients. So I think that is the next step that should be taken.
Questions?
Hi. Could either of you share your experience with? Could either of you share your experience with data collection or residential satisfaction surveys? I'm thinking when I think of applied research, I think of research in terms of data and statistics. Do in Ethiopia, or maybe from Michelle, your knowledge of new cities, could you elaborate a little bit on data collection and surveys, possibly?
Yeah. If you read any UN report, you're drowning in numbers.
And how architects?
Endlessly. Entire texts describing statistical observations with some analysis to it. We use that data, and but we try to move further into other domains. So data is important, but work in the library is extremely important as well. So it's not only the facts, okay, though, what we think the facts might be, because they can be constructed as well. And then, interview many different techniques. Interviews with local stakeholders is another technique. So you roam through a series of methods of how to approach the subject matter in order to get as many possible facets of the phenomena that you're investigating. But then the next step, and this is where the third mirror that I showed it comes into play, is you begin to project. So you take this information and you project. So and the moment you project, you design. So you can design data that is non-existent. You can design statistics ahead of time, okay, while looking backwards, trying to anticipate how things develop. And you can design urban design projects. You can deploy form. Okay, I love form. I think form is an extremely powerful instrument. And you begin to look ahead. And this is the key thing. This is to take research and to channel it along various scenarios and strategies to make it applied in a future condition. But it's artificial. As long as it's on the drawing table, it's artificial.
At what point do you feel that you are ready to intervene in this? That you are, I mean, that seems to me to be a crucial decision here.
Yes, yes, it's a good question. I think it's not so clean. Okay, you're thrown into something. For example, the issue of when did we write texts on our findings, we delayed it. Okay? We didn't have enough data, okay?
Right.
In abstract term to write. And at one point, when we did the Mercator analysis, realizing that there were forms of resistance within the community, we thought, okay, here we have found something that you could apply, also to the new towns. Okay, we say it's not just the new towns that they want to build in Ethiopia, but it's also another form of collective that is establishing its presence. And this is when we acted and wrote as an act. But then the pavilion that we built for the Addis Ababa University, it happened extremely fast. And it cost nothing. It really cost nothing. I used a fragment of the budget I had to build this thing, and it was so easy to find the containers. They were just, nobody wanted them, so we just got them and did this thing. The opening ceremony was more expensive than the building. So this is where you just had to move fast.
But the idea for the containers came from the place, because everybody
came from the place. Yes, yes, it came from the place. And I showed them to Wes Jones and say, "Come on, guy, you've been doing so pristine containers, but there are others." Okay, there are questions.
Yeah, sorry.
I refer to the case of Michel. Maybe it's wrong to mix or compare or decision-making model. What you presented is a strategy model, which has nothing to do with architectural theory. Maybe architectural theory cannot emerge under these conditions. I just went and visited Gerhard Schmidt, Professor Gerhard Schmidt in Singapore, and he said, well, we can't do anything, we are so controlled also by all these companies, So the situation now is that the architect is down at the end of the chain, so that's the problem. So maybe the right place to create theory is in academia, where we are not governed and ruled by decision-making, by economy or politics. So the emergence of theory of urban design can be done by those practices who still maintain their freshness and eager to be designers, and maybe academia. And another thing that I wanted to make a comment is that really the emergence of theory, it's based on generalization. And when you look at practices, and sometimes practices have the opportunity to do with reality, with their observing or being involved with reality, they have done things that we can observe and generalize. So take their experience and generalize, and what we say, isn't it grounded theory? We just build a theory on the basis of your observation, but going to practice and learn from what they do is completely legitimate today. So these were the 2 points that I wanted to make.
Well, just to react, I think the whole idea of academia as a laboratory for concepts on the urban is, of course, completely legitimate, and I'm not I'm not against that at all. My worry is that it stays in academia, and that is what I see happening a lot of times. So how to connect academia and the concepts developed here, for instance, to the outside world where it really happens, because the urban concepts, I don't think that that's why we're talking about applied research. The idea is not that this research on, for instance, new types of urbanity should stay within the confines of Ghent Hall. So that's what we're talking about here. So how to connect these concepts to reality?
Right, and I also would say, actually, just 1 second, that that for theory to be useful to practice, it has to be based on research, actually. And for research to be useful for theory, it has to be quite specific. I mean, you can generalize, but you have to generalize from something that's quite specific.
Right. Top and bottom up, anyway.
Yeah,
Bottom
but
up,
and
top
side
down.
too.
Yeah, bottom up.
Sideways.
Thank you to both of you for your really interesting presentations. Mark, I wanted to pick a little bit at what was obviously a very quick presentation, a very complicated story. So two things. One is more general and one is more specific. So the general issue is, I'm curious about, obviously with the way you framed it and the emphasis on the necessary reflexivity that has to accompany this kind of engagement in a different cultural context and so forth. I'm curious whether there's an unbearable moment that arrives, and in a context where the pragmatics of negotiating entry and the relationships institutionally, politically with the government, local authority, etc., whether that unbearable moment can in fact really be acknowledged, and is there an occasion to walk away because the burden of the complexity you've got to intervene into and the degree of reflexivity that you want to do it with actually calls on you to back off, right? So I'm curious whether that moment arrives or not,
Yes.
and what then happens? How do you negotiate that? That was kind of the general question. The more specific one is, I suppose, some of the paradoxes that you no doubt encounter on the ground when you deal with the pragmatics of development, with the pragmatics of employment, where there's a disconnect between the kind of normative, aesthetic, design impulses that you arrive with in terms of what an appropriate design resolution may be for a set of complicated intersections, and the popular cultural notions of local groups, local power dynamics, and when that is contrary to what your impulses are. And so I was struck by the notion of the referendum, the this and that, and so on, and kind of, so if you could maybe just unpack a little bit that really messy ethics of practice, and to what extent does that feed into the design resolution that that you arrive at some point? If you could maybe just give us some more flavor. Thanks.
Oh, this is an excellent question, and basically you've answered it. Yes, there are unbearable moments, and the wrong thing would be to exit them. I said exiting needs to be designed. So we led the school in Addis Ababa, and we are trying to find now a young Ethiopian architect to become the dean of the school, but he's not ready yet. He has to do a PhD, and I hope it will more than the drawing. He's now in Germany to get his PhD, and hopefully in a year or in 2 years he will come back. And so we are grooming people from within. But it would be wrong to escape it, to escape when you are in trouble. So and yes, there are these moments. The second question is more tricky, because you referred to me as a researcher intervening in the system, and there I have to say I'm not alone. Okay? I'm working with local people. So those are not my designs. Okay? So I'm saying this is not my design. I'm operating, I'm facilitating, I'm writing as a researcher, but I do not actively design. Okay? So there are projects by the students that were drawn for the exhibitions promoting the idea of the towns outside, but ultimately the designs are now the design for these towns and for these shelters were made by Ethiopian architects and retired Swiss architects that didn't have anything to do at home anymore and had plenty of time, so we said, okay, go there and work with them. So this is a totally different. So I'm not getting involved in it. But, and this is another aspect of your question that you answered as well, it is messy, it is contradictory, there are paradoxes, there are shocks. The presence of China in Ethiopia shocked me. The notion of, and the aggressiveness with which contracts are ratified is horrible. And the other thing that truly shocked me is the presence of sovereign funds, various states from all over the globe, and private industries leasing lots of land, I mean gigantic ones, for a period of 30 years, for flower production, for roses that go to the Netherlands, for example, or grain production for India, and not India, sorry, other places, for Korea. I know Korea is involved there. Oh, Saudi Arabia has bought leased large tracts of land. And the difficult and unclean role of the government in promoting that concept. So this is where you say, oh my God, you know, well, is this world savable?
Either one, it doesn't matter. Grab, take a microphone.
I wanted to return to Yves Blav's original question about the mirror, a little bit more directly in Michel Provost's talk. I felt as if the mirror was more lacking somehow in your talk. And you started with, I wanted to start with two things I felt were missing from the analysis. Industrial new towns, where there are lots of workers, and also really well-designed new towns. I mean, I think that there are towns that are being built in Asia which are actually quite exemplary and sometimes by local architects. But it seemed to me that within your analysis, one, you're not analyzing the power of local agents very much. I mean, you talk a lot about foreign firms, but you don't talk very much about the mechanism of local designers and planners who are, in fact, you sort of omit them as planning at all, in a sense, as if, you know, the cities aren't planned and the architecture is planned. There's something being done at the high end, but not the low end, whereas there obviously are actors at both ends. But I think also, it seems to me, in terms of the mirroring, that these cities are just so much like, and you started with that, I thought that was the most interesting part of your talk at the beginning, so much like European development. I mean, this is just capitalism in motion, and so that's the second thing. And I think the third thing is, what about the connections? These cities, I feel like there's a kind of exoticizing in the talk, where you're not talking about the connection back, where these cities are just part of a global chain of capitalism and commodity production. And the commodities we're using here are simply being built there. So it's not as if, I felt that there's a kind of inside-outside view here, where in fact everything is circulating and completely normal within capitalism. So the question for me is, where is the crisis is obviously much larger. The crisis is back here in the systems of capital themselves. There's a recent book by Min-Chi Lee that I think is quite interesting. It's called The Rise of China and the End of Capitalism. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I think it's an interesting thesis. It relates to, Mark and Leo, what you said about Africa as a new market, in a sense. But Min-Chi Lee's argument is basically that as this new market opens up, the last frontier for capitalism, that's a kind of limit point of capitalism itself. But I guess I'm looking for a bit larger critique than simply to look outside and say there's something strange in these new towns.
Yeah, well, of course, well, let me start in the beginning, and if I omit something, you will have to remind me of the all three parts of your question. And now I'm really forgetting the first part.
It was just about other kinds of cities. I mean,
No. You were talking about these local parties because, of course, I chose this subject to talk about because of this question on what should be the agenda for urban design. So this is a party of 50-year urban design department in Harvard, and what should be on the agenda. So of course, if this would have been at the Tianjin University, I would have chosen the aspect of the role of local architects. But this seemed to me most appropriate to you guys. But of course there is a role for the local architects. But what is interesting, to mix your questions a little bit, is that I felt, we presented this book in Shenzhen in December, and I felt very hesitant to put the conclusions forward as I just did. Because I had the same feeling that you are so eloquently proposing now, that this is a view from outside, making a sort of a caricature from these cities. So before I gave this sort of presentation of the launching of the book, I tested it on a lot of friends that we have in China, architects friends, like urbanists, for instance, the sort of the MAD offices, the offices that you would. They are usually trained in the West or even here at Harvard, okay, but they're still Chinese offices, completely immersed in Chinese practice, and they share the conclusions to the last comma. So I don't think it's a question of the outside looking in, it's a question of avant-garde looking at reality, of academia looking at commercial companies. So, and I think that's completely legitimate to talk about these cities in that way. And so also I should say, well, of course there's a lot of things that I haven't said, but this book has been completely written with all sorts of what we call foreign correspondence. So local people that have informed the book, because it is impossible to write a book on these cities in different countries when you don't know the language, when you don't know the politics, when you don't know anything. So this is definitely part of this research that I haven't been talking about, but that is definitely there. And I completely agree with you that this is very important to do so. But I think it's too easy to say, well, this is part of all sorts of global developments, and so it makes sense, it's completely logical that they look that way. No, I don't agree. I think it is absolutely part of all kinds of global developments, which makes them look that way, but that's not a reason to not interfere. And so that's what I'm trying.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. All right, so just from the last panel and this one, there seems to be this metaphor, we could say, of this desire, I think as Hashim put it, desire, whether it's virtual or actual, for some kind of continuity or some kind of direction towards that continuity. And in the first presentation, that metaphor was more applicable. Let's say the metaphor was more the boundaries between land and sea, perhaps in Freddie's work, land and water, the kind of inundation, the porosity. In Angelo's work, the idea of the flooding versus the flooded gaze, I think applies quite nicely to the mirror argument that you're discussing. And in this panel, it seemed that same kind of pixelated axis of desire was between theory and practice, but it's just as kind of frustratingly fuzzy as the first, which is probably why it's fruitful and why we can talk about it. But my question would be, if we just sort of indulge in one moment that is not fuzzy, that is not blurry, and say, from a personal perspective, I'm a doctoral student here in the Doctor of Design program, which is a program I think pedagogically tailored to breach this perhaps artificial boundary between thinking and making. If you were to formulate, Mark, your project in Ethiopia as a doctoral dissertation, let's say, that is trying to operate in this way, both in theory and in practice, my question is, if I were to dissect, let's say, Lacan and Guattari, and maybe you watched Chris Marker and Alan Resnick's film Statues Also Die, which would be very applicable to this also, as a kind of theory, and then the practice was the school, the creation of the school, that was the kind of design project, as well as the design drawings that came out of that.
my question would be, is it possible for theory in that kind of setup to have practice that is also made by a singular author? Does it seem that the author in this situation had to be plural in order for the theory to be applicable in one single project?
Correct. Correct, entirely correct.
Okay.
And what I enjoy about your statement is, first of all, your attempt to bring the two sessions together. Because I think that form, and I like the scenography of the conference, that to put form at the beginning, okay, as it was mentioned. Okay? This is kind of going back to the roots of our discipline, and this is what we know what to do. Okay? This is, and we have knowledge about it, and this is the instruments that we deploy. Now, we could also understand form as an actor, maybe even in a Latourian sense, okay, in a process of negotiation. So where suddenly urban design is read as a forum and as a platform to negotiate the various interests that conflict in practice. And this is where I see a strong tie between the two groups. Regarding the PhD, I have two PhD students working on Ethiopia, and we are investigating forms of north-south dialogue or dependencies. It's a very difficult subject matter that is driven by the UN. We have many countries trying to establish that for very different reasons. Why are the Germans in Ethiopia, for example? A very interesting case. I can't put a finger on it as well. But they are not involved in practice. They are doing a PhD. Okay? And there I insist. I want the footnotes. It has to be then crystal clear. So it can't be fuzzy. You might make an argument about the fuzziness of the subject matter, but the PhD has to be crystal clear.
There was another question over
My question relates back to the general. My question relates back to the topic of the session. I'm interested in the different models of research. Sometimes it seems that in the academia, the research ends up being mostly descriptive, perhaps with the thesis involved, and ends up with the book, and something that might take a year or 2 years. When it comes to practice, it's most of the times it's also dependent on a certain project and ends with that project. And I was actually more interested about a project that Michel didn't talk about, which is WIMBY, which I think is the third model. It involves some historiographic research, then intervention, and then a follow-up. And I think maybe a follow-up is also needed maybe 10 years later. And it seems that in architecture, research does not tend to move in that direction. I was wondering if that model is possible. Well, I guess it is in the case of Crimson. What is it maybe about Crimson that allows this type of research model to exist?
You mean kind of research model which ends up in an intervention?
Not only intervention, but also in a follow-up study to talk about the original thesis.
What makes it possible? Well, I guess it is rooted in a specific idea on what architectural history is. And it also, and that in combination with an inexhaustible desire to interfere with reality, I guess. So architectural history is usually, of course, you have to make a distinction between research, theory, and practice. But we have consequently chosen not to do so from the beginning of our office. So you can make a strong case for architectural historical research being something which doesn't end up which doesn't play a role in the past, but which doesn't end up in the present, but which is the tool to conceptualize future interventions. And I guess this is what we have basically chosen to do. And we've also been given the chance to explore this. And I think that could be, well, that's a bit of luck, and it's also the specific Dutch context, I suppose, that we could be a little bit too wide to expand on that. But in Holland, there is a very strong recognition of the role of history as an instrument to shape future interventions. Which has even been instrumentalized for the last 10 years, but it's been sort of a trend that we sort of anticipated on, and we're very lucky to be able to anticipate and ride. And also the value of history, architecture, culture, used to be very strong in the Netherlands. I think this might be a thing of the past, so I'm not sure how our office will go with that, but I think this is the kind of context that we have grown up in and that we were able to experiment in. Does that answer your question? No.
I would add something if I can. That I think that the model that is being proposed here could be articulated as an experimentalist model, which means that you study something, you initiate something, and you study the results. And you then act on those results. And so that very often when we experiment, there's very little experimentation in architecture because it's too expensive to experiment a lot. And there are too many contingencies, and it's just not set up that way. But that one can actually try to, and this is where you can really advance knowledge, actually, by studying the results. And that actually it was Manfredo Tafuri who drew this distinction between avant-garde practices and experimentalist practices. That avant-garde practices are about forging in new directions without looking at what the results are. Whereas experimentalism is all about examining what happens, examining the results of the experiment. So perhaps that's a model, and history is part of that. It's part of the process of examination and part of the material of the experiment. Question you had?
Just as a way of bringing this also back to the discussions that helped us come here, discussions about the directions or the agenda of urban design. I think two very, very helpful things have come out of this presentation now, which primarily have to do with the positioning of urban design as a discipline, as a practice. And as I think Rahul, referring to CERT, mentioned, CERT thought of it as a bridge or as a common ground. And in either case, there's a certain weakness, in the sense that it's not a discipline, it's a bridge between disciplines, so it's by necessity neither here nor there. And as a common ground, it can be a shared ground for everybody, but everybody can claim it to themselves, and therefore it's a contested ground. And I think the research that you've both presented has been very helpful for us in understanding urban design weakness as a strategic weakness, in the sense that it becomes possible for us to say, no, it's not the ground for landscape to conquer, as landscape is trying incessantly to do, nor for planning to dismiss as not being rigorous enough. But it's that operational ground that you've both experimented with between research and practice that has been quite remarkable to confirm that this weakness is okay. We can continue to be weak and thrive. The other dimension that I think has come out specifically in relation to Michel has to do with this difficulty of urban design in relationship to the predominant client of urban design today, which is the real estate market, at least as it has taken shape through the recent bubble in terms of international development. And the struggle that you have identified there, I think, is very helpful for us, as we move forward, in terms of, on the one hand, you're dissatisfied with the sameness of these projects, but on the other hand, you're dissatisfied with the way that they try to produce identity. And as much as I'm also questioning the fact that urban design has become increasingly responsible for this notion of identity in a world which is increasingly the same, I think that the negotiation between these two conditions is perhaps one of the strengths that urban design can play, or roles that urban design can play, in a manner that still is not played that well by any other discipline. And I feel that this is a strength to recuperate, or at least a role to recuperate, not by replicating sameness, nor by replicating identity, but trying to rethink the relationship between the two. And for that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much.